So you know from my last video that I was supposed to go to Canada for a month to work with the hacksmith to figure out how to run a YouTube channel. Well, I left, but I didn't make it there, and the story about how I got back home is a good one, so I figured I'd make a video about it. I've got two options for what I'm going to drive on my trip to Canada. My truck is a 1992 Mazda B2200, and it looks like something Clark Griswold would drive if he was a lumberjack. Now, I love this little truck, and it's done really well for me, but it isn't terribly reliable. It also has a couple of other drawbacks, like really low gearing, so whenever you're on the interstate, you're running really high RPMs, and because it's carbureted, you don't get very good mileage in that situation, like 22. The interior is also really small, so fitting all of my stuff in here to take the trip up there probably isn't going to happen, and I would have to put it in the bed of the truck and then risk it getting rained on and wet while I'm trying to get to Canada. But luckily I have a second option. I can just take my car instead of the old truck, and that is a Now let's get something straight. Every time somebody finds out that I own a Viper, they think that I'm rich. I'm not. When I was in the Navy, I saved my money and I went out and bought my dream car. Just so happens that my dream car is not very expensive. In fact, it costs about exactly the same as an absolute base model Kia Sportage. If you bought a Sportage instead of a Viper, I'd consider that a poor life decision. Now, my Viper is more comfortable than the truck. It also gets better gas mileage on the interstate, which I've checked at 28 miles per gallon, believe it or not, for an 8-liter V10. And also, it's typically more reliable. I've taken it on 3 cross-country road trips and never had a problem with it the entire time. It's been incredibly reliable. Plus, not that I would do it, but it'll do almost 200 miles an hour, and it sounds like this. So obviously, I picked the Viper to take on the trip.
Boy, I tell you what. I love my trucks, but I'd have picked the same thing.
So I'm cruising along, having a good old time, driving this thing through the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania, when my radio starts to act a little funny and starts to reset and try to keep starting to read the CD over and over. Now you might think that's a sign that something's wrong with the car, and I would too, but I've had this happen before in the past when it's really hot and I've been on a long drive. The radio starts to restart or not be able to read the CD. So I assumed that was what was going on, and I popped the faceplate off to let it cool off for a while to see if that would fix it. Now there's a second thing that would show me that something was wrong with the Viper, and that's the battery gauge. But as far as I know, no battery gauge in any first-gen Viper works, and mine never has. So I couldn't rely on that. But I did suspect that maybe something might be wrong with the alternator, so I started watching my gauges diligently, because the next thing that happens after your radio dies when your alternator's gone and you're running on battery power is all of your gauges fall to zero. Guess what? Gauges all dropped to zero and died. I knew that it was the alternator.
Listen, boy, I tell you what your problem is. Your problem ain't that your alternator died. Your problem is you bought a Dodge, and everybody knows Dodges suck.
The alternator from the Viper is Nippon Denso, which is from the Aichi Prefecture in Japan. Made in Japan.
Psh, man, I don't care what you say. Dodges still suck. You should have bought a Chevy.
I knew the alternator was gone, and I was running on a very small amount of battery power now, and I was in the forest with no shoulder on the road, so I had to get somewhere to at least pull off the road, if not somewhere that I could try to charge the battery. So I kept chugging along, but I kept at low RPMs, that way the injectors wouldn't fire as much, and the coil wouldn't fire as much for the ignition, that way I could extend the distance that I was going to drive. And I ended up getting within a couple of miles of the nearest town, but I didn't make it there. But luckily I did find somewhere to pull over once the engine started to shut off. So now I'm just stuck, sitting on the side of the road. I start calling people to let them know what's going on, and then I start calling around seeing if I can find an alternator or a tow truck to get me out of this little tiny pull-off that I'm on that people are ripping past on the side of the road. I called places on the side of the road to see if I could find an alternator. I couldn't find one. The story was the same everywhere that I called. This alternator is unique to first and second generation Vipers, and therefore is very rare, so it's difficult to get one. It would be at least a week, and it would have to be special ordered and paid in advance, and it would be about $300. But I thought maybe I could get the guts that are inside, because the case is unique, the alternator itself is not. But it turns out that people don't typically rebuild alternators themselves anymore, so trying to get the parts was just as difficult as trying to get the alternator. So fixing the car to be able to drive it home or continue on to Canada was not an option. After calling every single tow truck place in the region, I finally got one that was willing to take me somewhere, but they wouldn't take me home because I was 3 hours from home at this point. But they did agree to take me to a gas station to allow me to plug my car in and try to charge the battery. Now the battery charger that I had with me is just a trickle charger, because anybody that's had a first-gen Viper knows that they have a slow drain on the battery even when the car's off. But that only charges the car at 2 amps. It's a maintainer. It's not a battery charger. Oh yeah, and did I mention it's really hot outside? Well, then it started to rain, so I had to sit in the Viper with the windows on. And once I got as wet as I would have been if I just stood outside in the rain, I just stood outside in the rain. Luckily, my father wasn't working, and he loves driving through that part of Pennsylvania, so he brought me my quick charger so that I could try to get some more amps in my battery. But it was getting dark, so it was time to start doing some math. One of my friends and I were talking on the phone, and he was joking about buying 10 car batteries and just swapping them out to make the drive home.
That's my kind of engineering. My brother and I had the Bronco stuck, alternator died, went to Walmart.
But that's not going to work because the battery is inside the rear bumper, and the only way to get to it is with a low profile jack to jack up the back of the car. Then you need a church key or an extremely thin blade screwdriver to try to pry this cap off that covers the lug nuts. And then you need something that has at least 6 inches on it to reach these lug nuts because the wheels are so dished. And then once you take the wheel off, you need 4 different sizes of fastener removers to be able to remove the panel that covers the battery, and then you can get to the battery and disconnect it and do it. It's kind of a long process. I think it's fair to say that that's not really an option. After I explained that to him, he told me that I should just get jumper cables and swap jumper cables over from battery to battery. But that would require cutting off all electrical power to the car whenever I pull the cables off and put them on the new battery, which would mean I'd have to stop and restart or hope that I could keep it going. I don't know what that would do to the car, pulling all the electrical off of it and reconnecting it all of a sudden with a fresh battery. Nonetheless, it was a viable idea, but I had to figure out how to make this work. The initial question is, how many amps do I need to make it home? The Viper basically has 2 computers for the fuel system, and it has 2 different ignition systems running on it because at that time, Dodge didn't have another V10 except for the truck, so they ran a dual system of the 4-cylinder and the 6-cylinder, so it would have been incredibly difficult for me to try to estimate the amps that the car would draw just for it to be able to run. So if I go by what I found online, 30 to 50 amps was the basal metabolic rate of the vehicle for electricity consumption, basically. Because it was dark out, I had to run my lights. So for the rest of the electricity consumption, I had to estimate about how many amps I would take. And I knew how much wattage everything was, and it was running at 12 volts, so I could figure out the amps. And I knew that my headlights would suck about 10 amps per hour, tail lights and all the corner lights would suck about 5, and my dash lights, the interior lights that are you can turn off, but then I can't tell how fast I'm going or anything else, would be about 3 amps per hour. Now, this is all assuming that I'm not touching the brakes, because that turns on a second coil and draws a certain amount of amps, but I wouldn't know what the time period was for that, and it also neglects RPM, because with RPM changes, I would be drawing more current for the car's basal metabolic rate. So now I have an idea of how many amps I'm going to consume per hour, which is somewhere between 38 to 70 amps per hour. But that's not including the juice that it would take to start the vehicle, and you have to remember this is amps per hour, and I have 3 hours to drive back home. So the total energy capacity that I'm going to require to get this thing home is between 114 and 210 amp hours, which is a lot, and it's probably closer to the 210 number. So I had to figure out how to do that. Now, I was in a small little town in the middle of Pennsylvania, so everybody was super friendly and a lot of people offered to help. But my pops was there, so I just asked him for a ride to Walmart, and he took me over there and I picked up the stuff that I needed, which was 3 of the cheapest, biggest batteries that I could possibly find, which were about 60 amp hour a piece, a roll of electrical tape, a roll of speaker wire, and a set of jumper cables. So approximately with that, I have 3 60 amp hours, 6 hours of 2 amp charging. I got this from the trickle charger, 2 hours of 6 amp charging. I got that from the quick charger. Gives me 204 amp hours total, and hopefully less than 210 required to get home. Fingers crossed. I got back to the gas station with the batteries, and I put them here in the passenger area, and then I wired them in parallel with the speaker wire that I got. The problem was I still couldn't wire the batteries to the battery because it's behind the rear wheel and there's no access to it. Luckily, Vipers do have a jump post under the hood, so I ran the jumper cables that I got from the center battery around the seats and up to the jump post under the hood by going through the door and behind a panel, and I hooked it up. Now the Viper is going to pull evenly from all of the batteries, and it doesn't matter that I have thin speaker wire connecting to the center one where the jumper cables are, because there won't be that much amperage coming from each battery. Plus, I could always just reach over from the driver's seat and touch the cables and see if they were getting hot, and they weren't. So then we took a set of jumper cables that my dad had and hooked them up to his car and used that to start the Viper so that I wouldn't use as much juice from my set of batteries. And then I hooked up my cables and hit the road immediately. And started driving home in a blaze of battery-powered glory. It's still Dodge, but I tell you, I bet she was running good. Probably grinning ear to ear like a possum eating a sweet potato. And guess what? I made it the whole way home without running out of juice, even though it took till 1 o'clock in the morning. Since I got home, I took the alternator out, pulled it apart, tested all the components, and found that the rectifier All 8 diodes are very obviously burnt to a crisp. Luckily, these are only 30 bucks. Definitely beats a $300 alternator, even though it takes about the same amount of time to get one of these. But nothing like saving $270. As soon as those parts get here, I can throw this thing back together and I can be on my way to Canada. So don't worry, James, I'm coming. I'm just gonna be a little late, like a whole week, but I'll be there. The moral of the story is, since it's starting to rain, where there's a will, there's a way. I made it back for less than it would have cost me to get towed and less than it would have cost to get an alternator in a hotel room. And now I can fix this thing for cheap by ordering just the parts that I need online instead of replacing the entire alternator. And no matter how bad your problem or situation is, if you keep trying to find some way around it, I guarantee you'll find a solution. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Also, let me know if you like the redneck character and what I should name the redneck character. Planning on doing characters in more videos. Also, redneck outtakes for my Patreon supporters.
Just trying to get traction. This thing is so fast, it'll make your eyes sink back into your brain. You won't even have vision no more once you ride in this thing, man. You gotta be careful.